Hello. Today I'd like to talk about the essential problem with the woke narrative. And here's the problem as I see it. It's myopic. It looks at one group dynamic and loses the bigger picture. So the woke narrative focuses and perhaps obsesses on acts of racism, discrimination, and oppression by white folks against people of color, a phrase I'm not really crazy about. That is non-white people. Now, to be sure, acts of racist oppression by whites against non-whites are real. And historically, these were far worse than most of us realize in most cases. I am not denying that the history of our country has held a deplorable amount of racism and white supremacy, and I'm not saying that we've reached a post-racial utopia. Truly awful things have happened, and we have a long way to go. However, in focusing in this way and failing to have a broad and informed view of history, the woke folks end up with a myopic perspective that can only say, look at what white folks have done and continue to do to people of color. But if you know your history, you know this is not the whole picture. Sometimes on Facebook, I'll see people bring up the fact that the Irish have been mistreated in the history of our nation, and they were quite brutally. And then this starts an argument. But I think that people who bring up the Irish are not doing this so much to get on the "we're victims too" bandwagon, but to say that ethnic oppression has not just been white against non-white. The reality is much more complicated, or perhaps it's more simple. Ethnic oppression is a human phenomenon. And so if you look around the world, you can see ethnic oppression everywhere. Serbs killing Kosovars, Serbs, Bosnians, and Croats all killing each other, Hutus massacring Tutsis, Germans and Gypsies, Han Chinese and Uyghurs. And these slaughters aren't limited to just ethnic others, right? We can find plenty of examples of Muslims killing Hindus, and Hindus killing Muslims, and Buddhists killing Muslims, and Muslims killing Sikhs, and Christians killing Jews, and Jews killing Muslims, right? We find this throughout our history constantly. And we can even see this in social classes as well. Consider the abuse that takes place within the caste system of India. You know, there is more slavery in India today than anywhere else in the world. And then there was the imprisonment and torture and execution of huge numbers of people from certain economic classes in China, in the Soviet Union, in Cambodia. But the woke see only one racial dynamic and increasingly declare the United States to be a nation of white supremacy. And every time I see or attend programs dealing with equity and discrimination, this is what I see, this very narrow part of the problem. Is America really ruled by white supremacy? These white supremacists seem to be doing a pretty lousy job if that's the case, given that immigrants and their children from various Asian countries, along with Jews, are doing significantly better than white Christian folks. And that narrative doesn't explain why Black, African, and Jamaican immigrants are doing so much better than their Black American counterparts. The woke narrative doesn't fit with all the facts. And we should also consider that, I just want to qualify this and say, we need to remember that, yes, terrible things that white people have done to others are a significant part of our history, and there are plenty of examples. But you can find the same things perpetrated by people all over the world. Slavery has been a worldwide phenomenon, carried out by people of every skin tone. And today there are roughly 40 million slaves around the world who are still enslaved in this awful situation. The acts of oppression that white folks have committed towards others is an expression of a human drive, not a white drive. And seeing it the other way around is textbook racism. So the narrative that makes more sense to me is simply this. People are tribalist. We all exist in tribes, and these tribes can be ethnic, racial, linguistic, religious, national, political. And programmed into our DNA is a tribalism that has us favor our own and distrust others. And it doesn't take much for that distrust to turn to hatred. And it doesn't take much for that hatred to turn to the belief that the other is inherently bad. Sounds a lot like our political tribes today, right? And it doesn't take much more for that belief to turn to abuse, to slavery, to mass killings. This isn't new. We find this in our pre-human ancestors. I mean, look at our cousins, the chimpanzees. They practice the same tribalism and brutality. This is built into who we are. And while this programming had survival benefits 100,000 years ago, right now it's destroying us. But the remarkable thing is when we rise above it. And this is often taken the form of religious teachings and political declarations that demand that we reject the drive of our nature in favor of something better. But once declared, our actions don't immediately improve, right? When the Jews heard or read, "Love your neighbor as yourself," they didn't all say, "Okie doke," and simply do it. And when Jesus told his disciples to love their enemies, they didn't just respond, "Okay, got it," and carry it out perfectly. Islam teaches Tawheed, which includes the unity of all people, but they've had their own history of Arab racism. And Buddhists' first moral precept is not to kill, but they have killed and continue to kill those who are different. And the same is true of Hindus. And so when our founding fathers declared that all men are created equal, we as a nation didn't start acting on that right away, not even close. But look at the history of our country. We have slowly and painfully, and with the shedding of much blood, overcome our tribalism, at least in part. We've eradicated slavery. We've given everyone the vote. We've advanced civil rights. We've permitted interracial marriage. We are allowing gay marriage. And so the history of our country has been a slow, albeit imperfect, move away from our tribalist tendencies. And I think this is what Martin Luther King had in mind when he spoke of the moral arc of the universe bending slowly toward justice. This is the narrative that corresponds to the facts that I see. Our inherent tribalism and our slow progress toward greater recognition of our common humanity. We still have a long way to go, but this is the trajectory that I see. Now, when the narrative is focused on our common human nature in this way, we understand that we're all in this together. Ironically, it's our common distrust of others that makes us all the same. And so we can struggle together and we can celebrate our progress together. The problem with the woke narrative, where we understand American history as simply the white race against non-white people, is that we encourage more tribalism. It further divides us, thus increasing our tendency toward tribalism with its accompanying mistrust, discrimination, fear, and hatred of others. Am I exaggerating this? I don't think so. Race relations are discussed in higher education today as the bad things that white people have done and continue to do to non-white people, and the legacy of that. That is almost all of the discussion of race relations as I encounter it in higher education. We talk about race relations as if that's all there is, as if there aren't racist Chinese and Indians and Arabs and Koreans and Blacks and Hispanics in our society who aren't making things any better. This is a common human struggle, and we need to recognize it as such. And we're not doing that. In higher education, it's particularly bad. In my own field, right? I was just looking at some books the other day, and I didn't cherry pick these. I just stumbled on some books on religion in America. And they had titles. These are some of the titles I just quickly grabbed. The End of Empathy, Why White Protestants Stopped Loving Their Neighbors. The End of White Politics, How to Heal Our Liberal Divide. Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And finally, Unholy, Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump. Now, there's material in these books that is all probably true. There's factual material there, but this lens through which we view everything is way too narrow. I recently got an email from the United Way encouraging me to take part in what they called the Race Equity Challenge. And every day I'd get articles and questions to consider about how to achieve racial equity. And almost all of it was this radical woke agenda of here is the bad things that white people are doing, have done, and what they need to do from here. And all of their victims. So in discussing, for example, internalized racism, right, where you have this internalized sense of racism rather than maybe an explicit belief system. They defined it this way. Internalized racism is a set of privately held beliefs, prejudices, and ideas about the superiority of whites and the inferiority of people of color. Among people of color, it manifests as internalized oppression. Among whites, it manifests as internalized racial superiority. So the phenomenon of internalized racism is split by whether you are white or anything else. And we find the same thing when we define racism. Racism gets defined in such a way very often that only white people can be racist. If you're black, you can't be racist. And we all know that there are plenty of examples of people of all colors being racist. And even microaggressions, right? You can think what you want about microaggressions, but people talk about them. These small but harmful words and gestures that can, bring you down. But I came across a couple definitions of microaggressions. Again, I'm not cherry picking this. This was, mainstream, where microaggressions are these small, nasty things that are directed by white people towards people of color, as if microaggressions can't be directed towards anyone and everyone on the basis of all sorts of things, rather than simply your race or your gender identity. So when we do this, when we have this narrow focus and this split, right, between whites and people of color, when we do this, we only deal with whites as the oppressors and non-whites as the victims. Now, admittedly, this has been the case very often in the United States because whites have had more power in the history of our country. But this leaves us with the flawed notion that only one group has problems with tribalism, when in fact we all do. And unless every group, racial groups, religious groups, political groups, unless every group engages in the difficult and ongoing work of identifying and rooting out our common tribalist inclinations, we're not going to make any progress as a nation. And excusing any group from the task is not doing that group any favors. Our country's traditional motto of e pluribus unum, out of many one, is not an observation about how things are. It's a call for what we all must ever strive to be. That makes sense to me as the heart of the great American experiment. E pluribus unum. Yeah.